Hello.
Hello.
Okay. Good evening and welcome to the Americans for Safe Access patient-focused webinar. Tonight we will be discussing IP and patents as it relates to cannabis and those solutions, potential solutions for that. A little background about the organization. Americans for Safe Access was founded in 2002 with the goal of ensuring safe access to cannabis for research and therapeutic purposes. ASA engages in direct action and advocacy, education, as well as policy, consumer safety, and research. Some of the campaigns that ASA has going on right now is the End Pain Not Lives campaign, which focuses around the opioid epidemic and cannabis as an option for chronic pain. We also have a lot of training available at pfctraining.com or .org, as well as cannabiscarecertification.org, which is patient and caregiver education. ASA does a lot of work with the medical cannabis industry in terms of making sure the operations are safe and the products are properly tested. For more information, I encourage you to check out americansforsafeaccess.org or safeaccessnow.org. Our speaker tonight is Randy Micheletti, who is the founder of Incubate IP, a specialty law firm dedicated to helping small and emerging businesses build value through intellectual property portfolio development. Randy has represented technology clients, large and small, for nearly a decade and has been licensed to practice before the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office since 2003. He was awarded a master's degree in organic chemistry from the University of Pittsburgh after earning a bachelor's degree in chemistry and biochemistry at Augustana College. Tonight, Randy will bring us up to speed on the challenges cannabis companies are facing in obtaining patents, copyrights, trademarks, and will offer some alternative and sometimes even free strategies for getting around those obstacles. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Randy Micheletti.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it. And thank you to ASA for hosting this and inviting me to speak tonight. My video is turned off, Jehu, if you want to flip that on or not. I'm not much to look at, but that's up to you. In the meantime, I will start the screen sharing process here. Hopefully.
All right, looking good so far.
How's that?
Looks great.
Good. Okay, well, thanks for having me again. You know, I want to set the tone early and just say that Incubate IP is really focused on small and emerging companies, and I don't think there's a single cannabis company that would consider itself something besides small or emerging. So one of the huge reasons that I left the big law firms was that they simply did not want to handle cannabis company relationships, any of their issues, any of that stuff, mostly because of the banking regulations and all that mess. And so one of my motives was to get out of that restrictive system and build a more flexible, approachable platform that can help cannabis companies get the advice that they need to build portfolio value for your own company, for your investors, for your customers, and eventually build your own proprietary space in the cannabis industry. That's a tried and true method to take a startup business to huge success, is through intellectual property portfolio asset development, and there's no reason other than that nasty Schedule I that cannabis companies shouldn't also, take advantage of that model. So there are a lot of misconceptions. I do represent a handful of cannabis companies right now, and I hear a lot of, I guess what I would call urban legend, urban myth about what you can and can't do in the intellectual property space. To lay some of that to rest with good news, there is a lot you can do in the intellectual property space that does not require anything special just because you're a cannabis company. Also, on the good news, so far at least, enforcement agencies like DEA and the Department of Justice aren't really paying attention to intellectual property filings at the federal level to figure out who is operating in the cannabis space. I say currently because who knows what they're going to do tomorrow, but for now at least we haven't seen any evidence that DEA or DOJ is monitoring patent filings to try to increase their enforcement efforts. Again, big asterisk on that because who knows what Jeff Sessions and his minions decide tomorrow. But for now, at least, you shouldn't be too paranoid about executing on an intellectual property strategy with any worries of enforcement coming next because of that. So we can talk about some of those examples too. So before we get too deep into it, I want to set the stage here a little bit for what we're going to talk about. We are going to chat about most of the stuff in that middle shelf of buds there. We're going to talk about some patents, some registered federal copyrights, some registered and federal trademarks. We'll talk a little bit about trade dress, protections, and that dollar sign there is kind of a catch-all for licensing and monetization. And finally, we're going to talk about trade secrets just a little bit because I think they're really useful in this particular industry, and we'll talk about why. Top shelf stuff we're not going to get to tonight are regulatory issues unless they happen to cross into the intellectual property space. So, FDA is not my specialty, but obviously, my clients are dealing with FDA issues all the time. So happy to chat about it as the need arises. We're not going to really talk about morality either. I assume we're all signed into this because we all share at least some belief that there's good to be had in the cannabis industry. So if you disagree with that, catch me offline and we can have that conversation, but not tonight. And then we're not going to get into the ethics either. And there's an asterisk there because, this is a tricky space for lawyers. I don't think anybody else that's signed on as an attorney, but again, if you have specific questions about attorney ethics in this space, your first stop should be your state bar association. And if they can't answer your question, then there are other resources that we can get to. But we're going to leave that for another day, assuming that everybody on board today is more of an industry executive or an industry proponent rather than a pure lawyer like myself. So with that, I do have to say a couple of things that I don't want you to take home as a lesson today. This is not the official views of any law firm, let alone Incubate IP, which is a weird thing to say because I am Incubate IP, I'm the entire firm. So, I guess in a way it is the entire opinion of Incubate IP, but I'm going to reference some other experts in the field of legal issues for cannabis. And I don't want you to think that I'm speaking for their firms by referencing them. That's their individual opinions. So if you hear an opinion and I cite someone, don't read too much into that. And then the bigger disclaimer here is that nothing that I say tonight is specific legal advice for you or for your company. If you have questions about what's the right move for you or your company in this space, you should consult a qualified attorney that's in your state and licensed in your state, assuming that they're allowed to give you that advice. There are certain states where lawyers aren't allowed to give advice to cannabis companies. And so if you're in that situation, reach out to me. I'll try to help find someone in your area that is capable of giving you good advice. And for the federal stuff, federal trademarks, federal copyrights, federal patents, I'm licensed nationwide, so you can feel free to shoot those questions to me directly. But if your questions are more on the business side, contracts and, licenses in your state and that sort of thing, I can help you find someone in your state that can give you better advice than I can here in Illinois, unless you happen to be in Illinois. So let's dive right into the patents. And as of yesterday, this image is now out of date. I don't know if any of you saw the news headline, but yesterday, the U.S. Patent Office issued its 10 millionth utility patent. And with that, they redesigned the cover of the issued patents entirely top to bottom. It's okay, it's fine. I kind of like this traditional look myself. It's got a nice fancy gold ribbon. So if you've seen a real live patent from before yesterday, it'll have a gold seal and a fabric ribbon on it, and they're kind of slick. But that aside, let's talk about patents a little bit and what they can and can't do. Patents, there are certain varieties of those. There are three basic varieties. One that doesn't really apply too much to the cannabis industry, they're called design patents, and all they do is they protect the visual elements, the decorative elements of an object. I guess you could apply that to fancy packaging for your cannabis products, but it's probably not worth taking out a patent for that. There are other options that we're going to talk about later that would give you better protection at a much lower price than a design patent. So we're going to skip design patents pretty much entirely. We're going to go on to the two that really matter most for cannabis, and those are plant patents, plant variety patents, and utility patents. So plant patents protect strains of certain types of plants that are derived by man. So it can't be a seed you found on the ground and cultivated. It's got to be a much more of a crossbred kind of asexual type of plant that you develop in your greenhouse or whatever. Very useful for cannabis if you've developed your own strain, but they're kind of expensive to get. They don't really last that long either. They last about, I think 14 years is the most protection you can get on that. So long in terms of a business life perhaps, but not as long as the main type of patent that my clients tend to file in the space, and those are utility patents. A utility patent is the type of patent we normally talk about when we talk about patents. It's a patent that protects a device, or it protects a method of making that device, or a method of using that device. Those are the three basic types of protections you can get with a utility patent. Utility patents are great. It does not matter what the technology is as long as the technology is new. It is not obvious based on all the stuff that was developed before that technology. And as long as it's useful, those three criteria, new, non-obvious, and useful, it does not matter what the technology is. Obvious carve-outs of that, things that aren't useful, for example, cold fusion methods, since those have never been realized, they don't exist yet. Many people have tried to file patents on cold fusion methods and they get rejected because they don't meet that last criteria, that useful criteria. And even for things that are useful, for example, a mixture of extracts from a cannabis plant, for example, if you can show that that is useful at treating some disease or ailment, or it doesn't even matter, it could be an unrelated to healthcare. So let's say you extract an oil out of cannabis and you realize, hey, this works way better in my car engine than Quaker State. So you can get a patent on using cannabis oil for cooling your engine, keeping your engine running. Does not matter as long as it's new and useful and not obvious based on what came before it. Utility patents last about 20 years, which is fantastic coverage, or up to 20 years, I should say. At the most, there's usually a little bit of time cut off at the beginning while you're still chasing your protection, but for most companies, 20 years is way longer than they need to make an impact on the marketplace and probably make an exit somehow, either by acquisition or by licensing out or whatever. We'll get to those when we get to the dollar sign portion of the talk. So patents are very useful. What I love about patents in this space is you can even patent devices and methods that are totally illegal under federal law. It does not matter as long as you meet those other requirements, that it's a new technology, it's not obvious, and it is useful. So what that means for cannabis companies is that even your cannabis technologies, your cannabis extracts, your cannabis delivery devices, those are perfectly fine to go ahead and file patents for. And you might be scratching your head and say, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. Well, it does, because we need to talk about what patents actually do. Patents are not licenses to operate in commerce. You have to go through FDA if you're a drug company for that, or you have to go through some other regulatory body to get permission to sell in the marketplace. What patents do is they help you stop somebody else from encroaching on your technology, from using your technology without your permission. So, for example, if you developed that motor oil based on cannabis, and it takes off like crazy, and you figure out how to sell that properly in the marketplace, and you get a patent on it, and some other schmo starts extracting cannabis and developing a competitive motor oil, your patent may be able to stop the competitor schmo from selling their competitive cannabis motor oil in the marketplace. So that issue is separate from can you sell it in the marketplace. So I have no idea how you would get permission to sell cannabis motor oil on the open market. I guess that somebody would have an issue with that, but that's a separate issue. Your patent can be leveraged against a competitor who is trying to do the same thing or close enough similar thing that you're doing in the marketplace. So patents, we call those negative exclusionary rights. Your rights are only from a patent. You are allowed to stop someone else, or demand a license fee or monetary exchange of some kind from their copying or your copying of your patented technology. So these are great. These are totally fine. I have a number of clients that are filing patents on various formulations and delivery devices, and for recreational and non-recreational medicinal use. These are definitely worth considering. Typical cost to prepare and file one of these from a blank page can range anywhere from a couple $1,000s to $10,000, $12,000, depending on who you hire and how much work they have to do and how long and complicated the technology is. Total cost to get the patent through the patent office system varies probably from about $8,000 up to $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, depending again on how crowded and your prior art field is. Cannabis is not terribly crowded right now because nobody's really been incentivized to develop technologies in the space up until recently. So the good news is that the costs tend to be on the lower end of that range at the moment. I think they'll increase over time as more people file patents and the space becomes more crowded. But for now, there's space to be had. There's territory to own in the patent field in the cannabis technology. So I'll talk a little bit about trademarks now. Trademarks is another federal right, so that's coast to coast and at the federal level. When you see the circle R on a trademark, that's a federal trademark that's been filed through the United States Trademark Office and made it through the process. Trademarks are great for protecting brands, brand identities, product names, company names, slogans, short slogans, things of that nature, logos, if I didn't say that already. One problem with the trademarks, though, is the trademark law is based on a different part of the U.S. Constitution. And that portion of the Constitution is called the Commerce Clause, which means that your rights to a federal trademark are wholly dependent on your use of that trademark in interstate commerce. And that phrase is probably going to ring some alarm bells for most of you. Interstate commerce and cannabis don't really mix well at the moment. Certain states certainly have legalized operations, but you probably are aware that you cannot cross the border with your product, even in shipping from your own entity to your own entity. That's a no-no. That violates the Schedule 1 and the related interstate commerce laws. So that's a problem for trademarks. You cannot have a federal trademark, and you can even lose a federal trademark if you stop using it in interstate commerce between states. And so for that reason, most cannabis-related trademarks have been rejected or revoked up to this point. There are some exceptions. In fact, I was in Costco just a couple of days ago, and I noticed that they are distributing a product called Hempz, H-E-M-P-Z. It's basically body lotion or hand lotion that has hemp derivatives in it, or hemp products in it. It's a good example of a federal trademark that has made it through the system. It seems the leak in their dam right now seems to be if you can go on record saying that your product that you're shipping in interstate commerce contains no Schedule I material, none at all, zero, then they will sometimes let your trademark through the system and give you a federally registered trademark. I did a quick survey of the federal trademark database about 2 weeks ago and found all of 10, maybe 12 federally registered trademarks that were obviously for, cannabis related products, that in the record also said it's a cannabis product. So there are a few that have made it through the process, and if you look carefully at those, they were trademarks that were filed for long before the groundswell swept up on Schedule I and cannabis, and probably even before the first states enacted medicinal license options for within their own states. And so those are kind of grandfathered at this point, probably waiting for someone to come along and knock them out through a court process. But the cost for that's pretty high. So they're existing right now. They're not very healthy in my mind, and I think they're pretty weak in their longevity. So what does this mean for you? It means if you're a cannabis company and you have a cannabis CBD containing product, or any of the derivatives that are still listed on Schedule I, you probably cannot get a federally registered trademark for that product. Now I want to show you the next slide and really hopefully puzzle some of you and get the discussion going. I have up here four products that are sold on the open market, advertised openly, and they all reference cannabis-related themes. So from the top left there, the Sweetwater Dank Tank, and in the top right, the Sweetwater Brewing Company and their EPA, that's under the 420 brand. They're based out of Atlanta. And similar branding in the bottom left for them. And then Hemp Ale is, I think, a Colorado company that's brewed with hemp seeds. So the question is, can they get a federally registered trademark for their products? And if you notice carefully, it's a little fuzzy, but in the top right corner, you'll see the kind of road sign badge, the 420 badge, has a little tiny circle R next to it. So Sweetwater Brewing Company did manage to get their EPA 420 logo through the trademark office, rather. And I guess the question you should probably be asking yourself is, how did they do that? These guys, if you've ever met them, the brewmasters are total potheads. They're not hiding it at all. They're celebrating their stonerdom. And the question is, well, wait a minute, how did they get their federal trademark through the process? That's a clear reference to cannabis culture. And the answer to that is that their Extra Pale Ale 420 does not include any cannabis product at all. It's just beer. They've just chosen a label for it, a branding for it, a brand identity for it that references the culture of cannabis users. And so if you look in their trademark application file, you'll see that the examiner did ask them, hey, what's the deal here? This looks like it probably contains some cannabis based on, what I'm seeing in your trademark application. Then their response was, no, absolutely not. There's no cannabis, anything in it, no derivatives, no extracts, no additives, nothing. It's just the usual hops, water, barley, and thyme and heat and yeast, right? And so this is an important loophole that more cannabis companies should be taking advantage of. If you have products in your arsenal, in your portfolio that do not contain any Schedule I drugs, you can totally register a brand for that through the federal system, through the Federal Trademark Office. And in fact, some of the clever companies that are in edibles will make two versions, for example, of their brownies. They'll make a brownie that includes cannabis derivatives and extracts, and a version that does not include their cannabis extracts. They'll just make a regular old brownie. They will get their federal trademark for the brownie that does not include any of the cannabis-related extracts or oils or anything like that. They'll use that dummy product, let's call it that, to get their federal trademark. and they will label that with the Circle R version of their logo on the packaging for the cannabis brownie, the pot brownie. They will use the same logo without the Circle R. It's a little bit of a dance they're doing to get around the federal trademark system, but if you are a company that's developing a product line, strongly consider at least a small version of your product portfolio may be better off including no Schedule 1 compounds at all, simply because you'll be able to get some federal trademark protection for that branding. Otherwise, without the federal trademark protection, you don't have nationwide protection for your brand identity. Let's see. Oh yeah, I threw this one up here too. This is coming out of Colorado. This is one. Now that we've talked about products that don't have cannabis products in it, Dude's Brews in Colorado launched, I think, sometime last year, their world's first high CBD cannabis infused craft beer. No hiding there at all. They are celebrating that their beer is brewed with pot as much as they can get in it, and they are selling that on the open market. So you'll notice a couple of things. There's no Circle R next to any of their trademarks or their branding, right? They're just logos and images, no Circle Rs, because they're never, ever going to be able to get a federal trademark for this particular product line. If they brew a dummy version of it with no CBD and call it the Indica IPA, maybe they can do that. But in their current formulation of that with high CBD amounts, they're not going to be able to get a federal trademark for it. And then the question is, well, how do they get this distributed nationwide? And right now the answer is they probably shouldn't. It might be a situation where they can brew locally in every state that they want to distribute in. They just have to get the ingredients and the formulation and the recipe to a local brewer who will brew and private label a version of it for the local market. But for right now, they're not going to be able to be distributed by any of the major nationwide beer distribution channels. Oh, before we get to copyrights, I want to go back to trademarks. So federal trademarks right now are still problematic. We're fighting as much as we can, but right now the only way around it, as I mentioned, was to be able to honestly say to the trademark office, this product that we're branding with this cannabis-related branding does not contain any CBD or other Schedule 1 substances in it. If you can honestly say that, then you can still get your federal trademark. The other place to look, though, every state runs its own trademark office. Most people don't know about those because they're not super useful in most cases. They're very useful if you're a restaurant or a local merchant who has no plans to expand out of state. And I think because of the current situation with no interstate commerce allowed for Schedule 1 substances, including CBD, that the state trademark offices are a great alternative to federal trademark protection. So, for example, California runs a very robust trademark office, and if you are a cannabis company, a distributor, a dispensary, or even a grower that wants to protect your brand, which could be a strain, if you have a clever name for a strain that you've developed and you want to distribute that within your state, consider your state trademark office as a good alternative. They tend to be very cheap. For example, federal trademark protection the government fee start at $225 and goes way up from there depending on the types of products that you're trying to protect. Here in the state of Illinois, a state trademark application starts at $10. The state of Illinois only takes $10. I think California is closer to $100. One thing to watch out for, though, in California specifically, is that they will ask you in your California trademark application if you have ever tried to get federal protection for the trademark, and if so, what happened. And so if you are going to chase protection in California, my recommendation is to file in the state office at the same time you file in the federal trademark office. if you're going to try to do both. The reason being, the Federal Trademark Office takes at least 4 months to evaluate your application, and most states take on the order of 4 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks. And so you can honestly say, nope, we've never tried, if you file it on the same day in California as you do in the Federal Trademark Office. So check with the local trademark attorney in your area to talk about that option if it's intriguing for you. I think it's a great alternative, and more companies should be doing it. The state trademark offices are great, and since you can't distribute nationwide anyway, your protection in your own state is probably the most important thing for you anyway. So consider it not necessarily as an alternative to federal protection, but as an addition to your federal trademark protection, if you can get federal trademark protection at all. Okay, let's move on to copyrights now. Copyrights are really interesting, and I think another great alternative to some federal trademark protections that just aren't available, generally speaking, for cannabis companies. Copyrights are a federal right. They're nationwide, and it's a simple filing, basically a couple of pages in a form, and that's it. And the fees aren't bad either. On the order of $75 to $100 at the federal level, so that's pretty nice. Your federal copyright is useful to stop others from blatantly ripping off an artistic work. So this is a little bit different from trademarks. Trademarks protect your brand identity so that consumers understand where a particular product is coming from. That's not the deal with copyrights. Copyrights protect your creative expression of some idea, not the idea itself. That's a patent. But the creative expression of the idea is protected by copyright. There's 2 levels of copyrights, and I think these are useful for a couple reasons. First of all, filing a copyright, almost nobody does that. I guess you do that if it's a painting or a movie script or something like that. It's worth probably filing a copyright. A book that you've written, you need to have a federal copyright for the book in order to sign a distribution deal with a publisher or something like that. But most people skip over copyrights. It's just kind of an archaic system. However, it's a really great workaround for federal trademark protection. If you have a logo for your products and you can't get federal trademark protection, there's no reason you cannot get federal copyright protection for that logo through the Copyright Office. And you're thinking, wait, that's weird. Why can I get copyright but not get trademark? Well, again, copyrights come from a different part of the U.S. Constitution than trademark protection. Copyrights do not depend on your use of the artistic work in interstate commerce. They only depend on your own expression of some idea in an artistic way. Logos count as art. So if your logo is not getting through the Federal Trademark Office, consider a federal copyright filing instead. So all of those beer labels we were looking at, if they could not or did not want to get state trademark protection and probably couldn't get federal trademark protection, especially for the Dudes Brews high CBD brew, a great option for those graphic logos that I listed on the side of that advertisement are through the Copyright Office. Copyrights do not care whether your artistic expression is legal or illegal. That raises huge First Amendment issues if copyrights depended on your work of art being non-offensive or something like that. So copyrights are available for any artistic expression, whether positive, negative, legal or illegal or whatever. So wide open field there, very useful and very inexpensive way to protect your graphic logos federally without going through the hassle of the U.S. Trademark Office. There's another type of copyright, though, and that copyright is an automatic copyright that exists as soon as you create the artistic work. That's called a common law copyright. No filing required. It exists as, like I said, as soon as you create that logo, that treatment, that advertisement, whatever it happens to be. And by create, I don't mean necessarily print out on paper. I mean just design it. So if it exists in a file in your computer and you never do anything with it, you still have a common law copyright on that artistic work. The one thing I will say about copyrights that gets dicey, every state differs a little bit in how they handle ownership of an artistic work. You've probably all heard the phrase work for hire before. So if you hire a graphic designer as an independent contractor to design your logo, your whatever, for your product line, don't assume that just because you pay that independent contractor, that designer, don't assume that you own that design as soon as you cut the check to him or her. The law on that is a little complex, and your best bet is to consult a local attorney that's comfortable and experienced working with independent contractor agreements to make sure that you own the rights, all the rights to whatever it is that they create for you in that image. That's really important to do, and it's best to do that before you file for any formal copyright. Otherwise, like I said, common law copyrights are automatic, and so if the designer that you hired creates the artistic work, they automatically own the common law copyright in that design until there's a transfer by some written agreement. It could be the independent contractor agreement, it could be some other agreement, but there has to be a transfer of ownership to you, even if you're cutting a check to that person. So I strongly caution you, before you hire a designer, just check with a local attorney to figure out what you need to do on the agreement side, the independent contractor agreement side, to make sure that you own all the rights for that artistic work before you start slapping it on your product line. So I want to talk a little bit about trade dress. Trade dress is a derivative of trademark law. It comes from the same federal law that gives us trademark protection. And I have up here on the screen that we've all seen the ubiquitous ads for 5-hour energy drinks. They're literally everywhere. Interestingly enough, because of their advertisement, others have tried to mimic it or copy it, or I'm sure they would say honor it, but let's be real. They're ripping off the branding of 5-hour energy. You'll see 5-hour energy has the circle R next to the name on the label. You'll see that its copy, the 6-hour energy shot, does not have a circle R. There's no way on earth that they would be able to get protection for 6-hour energy shot when 5-hour energy is already protected with a federal copyright. There's not a chance in the world that would happen. So what they're going with is let's just blatantly rip off their label and sell a competing product, probably for a little bit lower of a price, and we'll just ride their coattails, the coattails of 5-hour energy in the marketplace. So besides federal trademark protection for 5-hour energy, that company also has what's called trade dress protection. It's an automatic free right. You don't have to do a filing. You don't have to do any kind of application. You don't have to have it approved by a trademark examiner before it exists. Like common law copyright, trade dress rights just kind of appear out of nowhere. And they appear when your product line has a particular and a distinctive look and feel, such that consumers that are buying your products automatically think of you when they see your product line, even if it's not labeled with your name on it. So I'm going to show my age here. When I was a kid, there was a commercial for a soda called Tab, and they always advertised it with a particular shape of a glass. And they started to use the shape of that glass in their advertising in various ways, to the point where the shape of that glass in consumers' minds automatically made you think of Tab brand soda. That is a trade dress. That is a good example of a trade dress. More common trade dress, I would say for you Apple iPhone users, the shape of the Apple logo isn't just federally protected, although it is. It also is a trade dress issue, the way that their product line essentially has no branding, no words, no nothing other than that Apple silhouette. Is a good example of trade dress protection that they've developed over time by using consistent look and feel in their packaging and their advertising. So that's what we're talking about here. It's the look and feel, the overall look and feel of product line, packaging, things like that. So your packaging engineers, your packaging contractors should be clued into this, that when you're developing a product line, you may have extra protection available under the trade dress statutes to build additional intellectual property value in your company. Now, the one caveat here, the one drawback of trade dress is that the only way to enforce it is in federal court. And right now, that's going to be very, very difficult because in order to have a federal trade dress protection, you do have to distribute your products in interstate commerce. And so we're right back to the beginning of the trademark discussion, where federal trademarks probably aren't available for most of your products unless you've got a dummy product with none of the Schedule 1 substances in it. So my advice to you in this, if you're developing a product line, if you're developing a look and feel of your packaging, it's still worth making a consistent, concerted effort to develop packaging that is consistent across your product line, so that when a customer sees it on a shelf in a dispensary, they recognize it, they know what it is, they know who made it, they know what the source is. There's still value there, and the reason for that is, again, if you can do that with a dummy product and carry that same trade dress, that same look and feel of the product line to your Schedule 1 including products, you've got a pretty strong advantage there, even in the federal system, through the trade dress law. So I know as startup companies, as young companies, you're always tinkering with the look and feel of your products. You're always trying to, make it look better to your consumers or pop better compared to your competitors. But there is value in keeping a consistent look and feel over time for your products. And it comes in the form of trade dress protection for those reasons. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what you do with IP. It's great to have it, but just having it, putting it on a shelf is kind of useless. That's not a good use of your dollars as a emerging company. And so there are basically 4 things you can do with your IP assets once you've attained them, whether that's a federal patent or a state trademark or even a federal trademark or copyright protections or whatever. That whole portfolio that you've built to protect your technology, what do you do with it? And it really boils down to, how do you convert it into money? That's what we care about. So converting it into money, like I said, there's 4 options. One of the most popular ones is a licensing deal, where you give permission for someone else to start using your branding, your technology, or whatever your intellectual property protects as a manufacturer, distributor, reseller, whatever it happens to be. Or, if you're, for example, if you have a patent on a particular formulation of cannabis extracts, and you're only going to chase in the marketplace, a particular use for that. Let's say you're developing, anti-cancer treatments for it. Let's say that's your thing, that's your company's thing. There may be other uses for that formulation that you don't care about, but maybe somebody else does. And so a license would allow that other company to chase other opportunities while you still get paid for developing the initial formulation. So don't overlook those. And as you're developing, patent strategies for your company, it's useful to ask yourself, well, even though I only care in the marketplace about this use, are there other uses that I can convert into easy cash that I can turn over to someone else and let them, worry about how to make it happen, how to develop the technology in that space that I don't have time or energy to worry about right now. So licensing is interesting. It's an interesting challenge right now for federal rights, because the forum for protecting those or for enforcing a license is, again, the court system. On the one hand, state courts are typically involved in licenses because they're simply contracts, and federal courts generally don't get involved in contract law, except in a few interesting situations. So if you structure your license correctly, and I think there's lots of ways to do that in the cannabis space right now, you can keep your license within a single state and use the state courts in your state, you should be fine. Where it gets tricky is leveraging a federal, property like a patent or trademark or a copyright across state lines. If your license crosses state lines, then it may be a little trickier to enforce that in a state court. Nobody's really sure how a federal court's going to react to a license deal for a Schedule 1 related technology. We haven't seen it yet, but my guess is they're going to be very hesitant to take on a case at the federal court level that deals with a license to an intellectual property asset that covers a Schedule 1 containing product. We'll get to this in the Q&A, I think, but it'll be interesting to see how Epidiolex is going to navigate that. They're a British company, so we're not really sure what their plans are for the U.S. market, other than they're very close to getting FDA approval for their product right now. So they're going to have to figure that out one way or another in order to make any money off of that FDA approval. One of the other things you want to consider very early on in your company's life cycle for IP assets is, can you leverage them for loans or financings or any kind of operating capital? So in the top right corner there, I have a bullet point about the 2014 FinCEN memo. When I developed these slides, the current thinking was from the federal government was, we're not going to enforce the Schedule I laws within a state that has a legitimate medicinal or recreational license scheme. The federal government just wasn't going to get involved with that. I'm sure you've all heard that the current DOJ Attorney General Sessions has reversed that and said we're gonna leverage federal law to the greatest extent possible. So many investors are a little leery about taking a lien on federal IP assets to Schedule I technologies, but some will still do it. Some are actually seeking it out intentionally. Again, it's probably easiest if your investor is in the same state as you, and even better if they don't bank at a federal footprint bank like a Bank of America or a Chase Bank or something like that. If it's a local banking operation, it's much more likely that they'll be interested in taking a lien on your intellectual property assets in exchange for operating capital. Again, this is going to be very state dependent, very specific to your situation and what your investors are comfortable with. But traditionally, for startup companies, leveraging their IP assets to get operating capital is a classic move, classic use of the IP assets. And in certain technologies, it's the only reason for getting an IP asset. So completely unrelated to the cannabis discussion, if you're developing a digital platform, a digital technology, those patent applications go nowhere other than they make great capital. They make great assets to leverage financing off of. So think outside the box when you think about IP assets, even if you don't think there's a good chance that your federal patent application or federal trademark application is going to be allowed. It still might be worth filing it if you can convert that couple $1,000 worth of upfront cost into a couple $1 million in operating capital through a financing deal that leverages those IP applications. So not necessarily using IP assets to their fullest extent there, but if it gets you from bootstrap or friends and family round of financing to a Series A, yeah, that's a great use for that IP asset, even if it's going to go nowhere in the federal trademark or patent office. So think about that. Franchising is another great use of IP assets, and these are typically developed as licenses to trademark. So when your brand is up and protected somehow, usually by federal trademark protection, you can convert that federal trademark into a franchise deal. So if you have a dispensary license in your state and you own the first one that pops up and you really want to expand your footprint, you don't necessarily have to own every single shop. You can sell the rights to use your branding in your state to another investor, another owner who wants to open up a shop in a distant part of the state that you don't really want to service yourself. So that's a great way to do it. Typically, like I said, there are federal trademarks that are used in franchises. So most of the fast food chains that you frequent are franchised under a federal trademark license agreement. But there's no reason you can't do that with a state trademark asset either. Your limit in doing that is just, again, going to be within the state that you have your state trademark approval in. So that should work fine for the cannabis companies that are licensed and operating legally within the state. There's no reason to think about outside of the state franchises, because that's problematic from an operative standpoint anyway. In terms of moving stock and moving people and sharing resources. So a franchise model is a great way to go, but in order to do that, I would strongly recommend a state trademark application, a state trademark asset to leverage that. And then finally, got to be a little bit careful here. I sat on a panel, I moderated a panel that was discussing these topics, and one of the attorneys piped in and said that her client had not only his business bank account seized under the FinCEN memo, but also his personal assets were seized at the same bank. So banks are really leery. The penalties for them are enormous for accepting deposits from a company that may be deriving it from illegal means, and that's still the case today. So my very practical advice to you: don't bank personally at the same bank where you bank with your cannabis business. Just keep them separated, and that probably won't happen. But something to be aware about there. So again, it's worth asking, and this extends to investors too. Ask them where they're banking, and maybe if it's worth considering banking at a different location than where your investors might be banking or your operating capital might be coming from. I do want to touch on trade secrets a little bit. This is one of those free options that Jehan mentioned at the beginning. A great alternative to any of the federal systems here, probably except for trademarks. But if you're not interested in taking out patent applications on your technology, trade secret might be a good way to go. Trade secret protection is valuable, but limited to the point where you have to be able to keep it a secret. So if you can't keep the technology a secret, if you can't keep the information a secret, this is not a great option. So for example, your branding doesn't work if you keep your branding a secret. It only works if you share that to the world. So not a great option for protecting your branding, but it is good for protecting your technology. So if your method of extracting cannabis that gives you a particularly rich oil in a certain substance that has a particular great use, you have a couple of options. You can file for a patent application in which you have to describe in excruciating detail every step that you took to extract it, or you can keep it bottled up as a trade secret and keep it to yourself. Trade secrets can last forever if you keep the technology a secret, if you keep the information a secret. They're great for protecting things like customer lists, vendor lists, what else? Like I said, methods that you've optimized that you don't really want to share with everybody else. Pretty much anything that can't be reverse engineered. So, if you're working on that extract and you figured out a way to treat the cannabis material to get that extract, and you don't think anybody else can figure out how you ended up with a formulation with that particular mixture of compounds in it, then trade secrets is a great way to go. What you can't do, however, is mix and match. So you have to decide before you market that technology whether you're going to protect it by a trade secret or by a patent. You can't protect it by a trade secret as long as you can keep it secret, and then when you think, oh, it's at risk of being blurted out or shared elsewhere, then file for a patent application. That's not allowed. You have to file for your patent application before you launch in the marketplace. Otherwise, you can't file for a patent application at all. So your trade secret is that's a fork in the road moment for you. When you're ready to launch that product, you have to ask yourself very, very carefully, can we keep this technology secret? And if not, then it's probably worth filing a patent application on it. But they're essentially free. The only costs really are, I strongly recommend a good employee agreement or independent contractor agreement, however you set up your company, to make sure that there are severe and swift penalties for any employee or former employee who lets the cat out of the bag on how you do your trade secret protected technology. So that is very much worth consulting with a local employment attorney near you to figure out how to word an employee agreement, or even a consulting agreement or a independent contractor agreement before you hire that person for their services. Because like I said, once the secret's out, you can't put it back in the bag. You can't protect it anymore, and that means that anybody has free reign to use the same technology as long as they can figure out how to do it. So great protection if it's available, not always available, not always the best option. And that's pretty much it. I want to thank a couple of people. First of all, Jayhana and the organization for inviting me again. Appreciate it. And then a lot of this information came from a panel that I hosted a couple of years ago at my law school alma mater. So I do want to show their pretty faces on the screen with their current affiliations. Green Thumb Industries is a huge growing industry business here in Illinois, and Dina was fantastic on the panel. She was an independent lawyer like me, and then convinced her to go work for them full time after the presentation. So she made out well. And then here's page 2. So these are some of the Illinois players on the left. Teddy and Charlie both have licenses here in Illinois. Charlie's interesting. He came from the banking and finance mortgage industry. And so, he's pretty comfortable that regulations are coming. They went through that with the mortgage bubble already, and he was pretty happy. And Allison Malsbury's pretty interesting. If you haven't heard of her, she's an attorney out in Seattle and runs a really great blog called the Canna Law Blog, CANNALAW blog. Strongly recommend following her on that. She keeps a really good up-to-date list of what's possible in various states in terms of intellectual property protection. She's a great trademark attorney too. Strongly recommend checking out her blog if you haven't already. And then, if you haven't read it yet, it's a quick read. I love this book, John Hudak's Marijuana. It's more on the social history of marijuana and why we have CBD and all these products on Schedule 1 at the moment. I think it makes a pretty compelling case that there's no real good reason for it to be listed there anymore other than historical, social, and even racial artifacts of our U.S. culture. So check that out if you haven't. And no, I'm not getting a royalty off of the sales from him. I just really like the book. So that's it. My contact information is here. Like I said, I can take Q&A. I know we're running pretty close to 8 o'clock. But if you have Q&A, I'm happy to answer them now as we have time, or you can catch me offline at any of those contact locations.
Wow.
So, thanks again.
Thank you, Randy. That was a great, it's almost like an IP training for people who are new to this. We do have a couple of burning questions.
Good.
And I understand that these answers will be from your side of the table, how you see it. But you mentioned Epidiolex, which is a purified CBD extract, and we're anticipating that becoming a scheduled drug, being an approved medicine. And I'm wondering if you can comment on what would be the impact, and we're anticipating this decision in a couple days or by the end of the month. What would be the impact of having Epidiolex, a CBD product, as a scheduled drug on other cannabis and hemp companies looking at patents for their CBD products?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Epidiolex right now, I think, is in their current state at FDA is that the panel has recommended approval, and I think it was a unanimous decision even for a couple of very, very small indications. It's an interesting case. One of the companies that I used to represent, not in the cannabis space, just in pharmaceuticals in general, was in a similar spot where the panel was very positive on the data, the trial data, and then FDA ended up not approving the drug anyway. So I'm very curious to see what FDA at large does with the panel recommendations. It's not a foregone conclusion that they're going to approve it, even though the panel recommended it. So I think you're going to see a couple of things. One, you're going to see the political impact of the current administration weigh in on Epidiolex. I don't think that they're going to be too thrilled about that drug being on the open market for the exact reason you said. I think it opens up, in their minds, a Pandora's box of, well, once we approve it for epilepsy, what's next? That's to the current administration. I'm anticipating that they'll view this as a slippery slope, where once that approval goes through, then they're going to be in a tough pinch to not approve it for things like migraines or whatever. So yeah, that'll be interesting. And like I mentioned, during the discussion, I think it's also going to be interesting to see how GW ends up structuring their business to distribute that product nationwide. They're not going to get an exemption, I don't think, from any of the Schedule 1 the transportation regulations, for example. FDA has no power to exempt GW or its subsidiaries, its U.S. subsidiary, from any of the Department of Transportation regulations or any of the other regulations that would impact interstate commerce of a CBD containing product. So you could also see the situation where FDA approves the drug, but every time they ship product across a state line, the truck gets stopped and the product gets seized and stored in a locker in the federal government's warehouse somewhere. So I'm curious to see how they structure their business to get around some of those issues. It may simply be the current model for the rest of the cannabis industry applies, where you just have to silo your operations state by state and operate within one state only. That's going to be difficult, I think, from an economic standpoint, because the number of patients that are affected by the indication that Epidiolex might be approved for is pretty small. So that's going to make it very challenging for them to manufacture locally at a scale that's profitable for them. But we'll see what happens. They still have this hurdle to get over to get FDA's final approval of the drug. From the IP standpoint, there should be no hurdles for them. I actually haven't looked to see if they have patent applications on file for the drug. I assume they do. That's a standard move for branded drugs. They'll get listed eventually in what's called the Orange Book, which is the kind of database of patents that are related to FDA-approved drugs. And that sets the stage for, I think, what could be very interesting also with the Epidiolex product is that once their branded exclusivity period expires, every generic company on the planet is going to try to file for a generic approval with FDA to manufacture generic Epidiolex. So that battle is always by law waged in a federal court. So you're going to see, I think in a few years, if Epidiolex is approved, you're going to see the first generic patent litigations in federal court on a Schedule 1 drug, and that's going to be groundbreaking to say the least. So a lot of interesting IP issues here, and we haven't even touched on it. They're not going to be able to get federal trademark protection for their branded drug either. That's usually a huge part of the IP portfolio for a branded drug is the fancy name you give the drug itself. That's Viagra. The value of the name Viagra is enormous. The value of any branded drug that you'll see is enormous because of the nationwide protection of that brand. I don't think Epidiolex is going to have that in their portfolio, just because I don't think the Federal Trademark Office is going to allow it, just because FDA says it's useful to treat this particular set of patients. So that's sort of my take on Epidiolex. I'm still watching it carefully. I don't know that it necessarily means that once Epidiolex is approved that you're going to see nationwide approval of all cannabis technologies or delisting of CBD off of Schedule 1. I don't think that's a foregone conclusion, and I think, for reasons better explained in John Hudak's book than I can get into, I think the current political climate is going to be a huge barrier for a delisting of CBD off of Schedule 1, regardless of Epidiolex.
All right. Wow. Thank you for that thorough explanation. There's some things I hadn't thought about there. I think that's fascinating about getting that federal trademark protection. That is really interesting. And I guess one other follow-up to that is there's a lot of talk on the internet for years about this government patent on CBD for neuroprotection. What's that about? What does it mean? There's a company who's purchased it. Could you comment on that government patent if you're familiar with it on CBD?
I am. Yeah, I'm happy to chime in on that. So the patent number, if you're keeping score at home, is 6630507. It is a patent that was applied for in the late 1990s and approved a few years later for methods of treating certain disease states, oxidative stress, neurodegenerative diseases, and ischemic diseases, using extracts or certain compounds that were derived from cannabis plants. Interestingly enough, if you dig into the details of how they derived these compounds or identified these compounds, they literally bought the raw materials from a chemical supplier. They didn't extract the plant themselves. They didn't grow it themselves. They called up their local chemical supplier and bought the CBD oil off the shelf, basically. So a lot is made about this patent. I think the short story here is that government agencies and even universities, anybody who's being compensated under a federal grant, typically has an obligation to file patent applications on whatever technologies they develop out of those federal monies. The theory being that if your tax dollars are paying for that development, then at some point the technology ought to be given to the public. And the only mechanism right now for that to happen is through the patent system. So the trade-off for a patent is we're going to give you, as the federal government, we're going to give you a limited right in time to stop others from stepping on your toes with your technology. But since the government paid for it, we eventually want that technology to be accessible to the entire country, not just people that were on that project. And so most federally funded projects have in the contract, in the federal grant papers, an obligation to file patent applications. My guess is that's probably what happened here, is that the group of researchers that did this, which by the way were California and Maryland, I don't know their exact affiliations at the time, but my guess is they were academic researchers or government scientists that did the research. They probably had an obligation to, one, file the patent application, and two, assign it back to the United States as the owner of the patented technology. So I know a lot's been made about this in the social media and the press, but I think the best explanation for this is it's business as usual for the federal government. We're going to pay for your R&D, but in exchange, we want you to transfer that technology to the public at some point in the future.
Okay, great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When I was studying, in basic research, looking at cannabinoids and anti-cancer effects, we were federally funded, and the institute looked at patenting that, even though there wasn't really a chance to use it in an application. We got a question coming in while you were answering the last patent question. What happens when that patent expires, whether the federal patent expires or whether it expires for the company that currently owns it? Does anything change, or?
Well, one thing that's clear is that once any federal patent expires, the technology is free to use by anyone. Now, that doesn't, again, exempt you from any of the regulatory restrictions on the commercialization of that technology. For example, that patent, the 507 patent, is very specific on methods of treating patients. Just because the patent expires doesn't mean you can start injecting patients with whatever is disclosed in that patent. You still have to get FDA's approval before you start, injecting patients or treating patients with the compounds. But what it means is that you won't have to pay a royalty to whoever the last owner of the patent is. So this particular patent, I think, has an exclusive licensee, which is fancy speak for essentially owner of the patent. Right now, they're in a position, that company is in a position to stop others from using the technology that's protected by that patent. Once the patent expires, then they lose that ability to stop others from using that technology in the public for a fee. Don't start early though. They can, even after the patent expires, they get about 6 years in time to wait to sue someone. So don't start early. And in fact, the patent office puts a calculator on their website to figure out when a patent expires. You kind of have to dig into the details a little bit, and if there's confusion about it, check with a patent attorney who can do the math for you and dig into the filing details and make sure that the math is correct. But by my rough estimation, it will expire no later than 20 years at 2019, so next April is the latest. That should expire. So, but again, don't quote me on that. There's more math to do, but that's the basic rough estimate right now is next April.
Great answer. Thank you. That's very interesting. Last question, and then we'll wrap up here. A couple months ago, there was a GQ article that came out, just getting a little context for this question, about a company that was patenting cannabis varieties and processes. And it brought up this discussion of, whether that, how that will be used. Will it prevent other people from using that technology or those types of varieties that have those same active ingredients? And so I guess the best way to ask this question is, how enforceable are the cannabis patents on varieties or processes for making products in the U.S. right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the only forum for protecting technology through your patent, so if you were the patent owner, the only place you can file a lawsuit is in federal court. So we get into that same kind of sketchy area that we just talked about with other assets with licensing. Can you march into federal court and get a federal court to weigh in on this cannabis technology? Probably, but not 100% sure. So federal courts in the United States have exclusive jurisdiction over patent disputes. And so you don't have an option even to say, we're just going to go to the local state court instead. They will bounce the case immediately and say, nope, you've got to go to the federal courthouse to hear this dispute. So again, I haven't seen any cases yet. In a vacuum, I would guess that federal courts that are in states that have a licensed program, whether that's for growing or dispensing or whatever, even if it's just medicinal, I would think would be more likely to hear a case on a cannabis-related patent than a court, say, in a state that does not have a state licensed program. That's just my own kind of hunch at this point. The interesting thing about federal courts is you still have to pick a federal court that's relevant in geography to where the parties are. So if you are a California company and you developed a patented product that you have a federal patent on, and you want to sue a company that is in Illinois that has developed a competing product that you think infringes your patent rights, you can't choose a court in Texas necessarily to hear that dispute. You can't necessarily pick a federal court that's in Washington D.C. to hear that dispute. It has to be related to the parties. So generally speaking, I don't think there's going to be a ton of issues in that because a company that's developing a technology and selling it is hopefully going to be licensed in that state to operate. And even if you're crossing a state line there, a California company suing on its patent against an Illinois company, you're going to be in one of two states that has a federal state licensing program for operating at some level. I don't think there's going to be a huge problem with that. At least the more sophisticated federal judges that hear patent cases a lot don't seem to get distracted all that much by the type of technology they're working on. For example, when I was a young attorney, I worked on a stem cells case when stem cells were still kind of taboo, and in a similar watered down version of the cannabis ethics and morals kind of quandary. The judge in that case was 95 years old and couldn't care less that it was stem cell technology. He just wanted the case done. He wanted to get it off of his bench. We never got to a jury in that case, and so we didn't get to test, which jurors would be more or less likely to be on our side because it's a stem cell derived product or whatever. But I think that could be an interesting case. Jury selection in a patent case might be interesting for cannabis-related technologies. I could see certain states having more or perhaps less jaded views of cannabis-related technologies than others. But that could be interesting. I don't know of a case that's a federal patent has been leveraged in a federal lawsuit yet. But I think those are some of the issues that I would be concerned about. Would be, is the judge going to care whether this is a Schedule One, illegal product or not, or are the jurors going to care when we get to jury selection? Those are just sort of the issues that would pop into my head right away.
Okay. Wow. Thank you very much. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to this webinar provided by Americans for Safe Access. Thank you again, Randy, for your time and your expertise. Be sure to check out safeaccessnow.org for more information and a ton of free reports and information about medical cannabis and patient advocacy. And be sure to check out our YouTube channel, our Safe Access YouTube channel, for our other webinars. And this one will be uploaded in a couple of days to that channel. All right. Thank you so much, Randy, again. And I wish everyone a good rest of your week.